His head started to really pound, his vision spun crazily, and the goat's eye rose silently up into the air. Groaning as the fire in his head grew hotter, Dantar bent his will, and the eye headed for the light. The Wandering Eye. Far away and long ago, there was a small town that stood on a busy trade road in the border kingdoms, called Drundown. You will seek it in vain on even the best maps today, but back then, it was full of folk who considered themselves important, because wagons groaned past their doors all day, heaped high with exotic things from far places. One of them was a red-faced, greedy, rather pushy merchant named Dantar Mree, who saw himself as a baron in red velvet someday, the baron of a much larger, grander place than Drundown. All he needed was 7 times as much coin as he had, and a tall castle, and tall, handsome sons, and respectability. Dantar was increasingly fat, and had just built himself a big new warehouse, so he was on his way to a baron's coronet. He even had heavy gold rings on some of his fingers, a wife who was still beautiful but getting plump and looking increasingly tired, and a son, just one, who was neither tall or handsome, but was instead a bumbler and a dreamer, and went off alone into the forest far too often. Yet, Dantar could see that shining baronial coronet, and, for the most part, was well pleased. Dawned there a day when Dantar fell angrier than usual at his bumbling son, who was named Dantar, and who had a secret. He had the gift. Not just the ability to feel and smell, and so presumably to wield arcane magics if properly trained, but a wild talent that bubbled up within him, unbidden at times, to leak forth, violently and spectacularly, whenever he knew strong rage or grief. So Dantar, son of Dantar, learned young to withdraw, to slip away, to look out over the trees of the distant mountains, and open his heart and yearn to find calm, or forlorn melancholy, or nothing much at all. So his father judged him a do-nothing, too gentle dreamer, or perhaps someone who slipped away to try to seduce younger and even weaker ladies, or some such useless dross. Dantar little suspected the truth, that a wandering, curious Dantar had years before found the scorched bones of a dead man in a cave, and nearby a few crumpled pages thrust into a crevice in the rocks of the cave wall that set forth spells. Spells that Dantar had read and reread hundreds of times since that bright day, going off alone into the gloomy depths of the forest to try to cast, usually without any better result than tingling and sometimes glowing fingers, save when he was furious or weeping in frustration, which was when he could blast trees to ashes or uproot them and smack them to splinters like the worst windstorms did. Dantar had scared himself so much doing that, and nearly setting the forest on fire, that he dared to practice magic less and less, and do sadness more and more. So one sadder day than usual, when Dantar roared and snarled at his son for being a useless crow cockerel who'd never amount to anything, Dantar's gift boiled up and out of him like fire and lightning clawing at each other, and scorched the north end of Dantar's big new warehouse and set all the wares within it aflame. And Dantar raged at his idiot son and threw things as all the men and women of Drundown raced to douse the flames, and Dantar's mother, Drera, wept in staring terror at what her revealed monster of a son had unleashed. And Dantar shouted that if his son was not out of his sight before next morning for good, there'd be a fresh grave dug and Dantar Mree in it to see an end to all this foolery. So Dantar raced to his room and put on his best boots, then took his precious few pages of spells and a cold-cooked goose and a hand sack of apples from the kitchens and fled the town. He went along the trade road, of course, heading for the next town, Alvorn, for everyone said it was larger and richer than Drundown, so perhaps he could find work there. Some folks said Drundown ended at Lust's lamppost, and some said its boundary was the old weighbridge beyond. And when a sad and downcast Dantar stepped off the far end of the bridge, a dark figure stepped out from behind a tree and gave him his first scare. But it was only old Tarland, white of beard and bald of head, who handed Dantar a small purse of coins for your first night's bed and meal, lad, and added to them a warning. The Baron of Alvorn jailed and enslaved all who could work magic and weren't holy folk. The old man melted back into the trees before Dantar could ask him anything, so he went on his way, wanting to know why a baron would do such a thing. He was still wondering as the sun sank low in the sky and the forest thinned to show a footsore Dantar, son of Halago, a broad, rolling land beyond that was likely the barony of Alvorn. Which was when men burst out of the trees all around him with cudgels and knives and unpleasant gap-toothed smiles and pounced. Fear spurred magic ripping out of Dantar in a desperate shout that sent the brigands fleeing with broken tree boughs whirling all around them, thudding home hard enough to shatter arms and dash men headlong. And then he was alone again and panting as men fled deep into the woods and left him. He never saw the watcher who rose from behind an old stump to watch him trudge on into Alvorn, then hastened away along a narrow track. That watcher wore the red triangle patch that marked him a man of the Baron. And so did the 5 men at the watchpost that he dashed to, but they all did off their livery to put on old motley rags, then ran like hares, leaping before war dogs. They were hardy and fresh, while Dantar was weary and heartsick and not a jack of action. So, as he came to where the trade road emerged from the forest to descend into Alvorn, they barred his way with sneers, and in silence closed in around him, long staves in hand, and struck. Dantar shouted out a spell again, and once more wood shattered and whirled, both staves and tree limbs all around obeying, to fell 2 men and then a third, but then his own hands and shoulders burned numb from the staves smiting him, and then a terrific blow sent him staggering, and another brought down dark oblivion. Well now, perhaps this will finally be the sword I've been seeking to carve up Rosimkar and Holver, too. Baron Macarnath of Alvorn was not a lovely man at the best of times, and when he was gloating, was far from the best of times. He hated his rival barons, who were all wealthier and more successful, and far more loved than he was. Bah! He drained another jack of his favorite fire wine and watched his spies happily sprinting away to spend the coins he'd just given them. Small price to pay for an empire. The pain brought Dantar awake, his head afire and spinning, his arms and shoulders bone-bruised and aching. Around him was cold stone and damp, and the faint stink of decay, and a worse stink that meant someone long unwashed was nearby, that way. Which was where the only break in the stone walls was, a doorway into darkness, blocked by a door of iron bars as thick as his own wrists. He was in an empty room, a dungeon cell. The only light came from above, and just as he started to peer up at it, trying to focus his blurred vision, the light dimmed. A man's unkind voice growled, "Thirsty?" And foul water splashed down on Dantar's head. He spat and choked and shook himself like a dog, discovering that he was ravenously hungry, and that all he'd been carrying had been taken from him. I'll die if I don't eat soon," he cried as loudly as he could. "Ha!" came the reply from above. But a moment later, small but heavy things pattered down all around Dantar. "Eat your fill!" Dantar found himself staring blearily at the raw, freshly severed hooves and head of a goat. His stomach heaved and he fought down sickness. Then he forced himself to thumb one dully staring eye out of the head and tried the shortest spell of his meager memorized handful of magics, the one he'd never had a chance to use before, the Wandering Eye. And it worked. His head started to really pound, his vision spun crazily, and the goat's eye rose silently up into the air. Groaning as the fire in his head grew hotter, Dantar bent his will, and the eye headed for the light, his sight sliding into it and through it to see what it could no longer see. When the eye soared up into full light, Dantar's head pounded and swam, and he couldn't stifle a long groan, but after a time of suffering, he found he could see through the eye, and the eye flew about at his bidding, and so he saw much. He beheld the way out of his cell, and that the smell in the next cell was a huddled old man, filthy and in rags, manacled to the wall, unlike Dantar. There were 5 other cells beyond, but they held only heaps of human bones. It took him some time, but he saw where the keys hung, and how to get out of the castle, too. It was a big place, thrice as large as the grandest home in Drundown, but it was old, meaning it really was a castle, and not a fanciful mansion with a moat and some turrets. And it had been built by someone straightforward, so room gave into room with a minimum of secret passages and puzzling maze-like architecture. Dantar saw the murky green moat, and the back kitchen with its hatch where slots were tossed out into the moat, causing the waters to briefly boil with hungry eels devouring before their fellows could, and he saw the bright pennants of Alvorn fluttering in a strengthening breeze. He saw also horses being readied in the stable courtyard, their saddles hung with crossbows and quivers, and racks of long boar spears being carried out to flank them. So, a hunt in the forest. And Dantar saw the Baron of Alvorn standing before an iron-bound door, looking over his shoulder to make sure he was alone before touching the nail heads of its bindings in a particular pattern, here, there, yonder, there again, which was a mistake, because the heavy-browed man spun around and looked up suddenly and met Dantar's stare, which meant he'd seen the Wandering Eye hovering in midair looking down at him. The Baron of Alvorn was a man of action. He opened and immediately slammed the door again in a grunting trice, then hurled his belt dagger. It flashed close enough that Dantar flinched and sent the goat's eye racing away. "Guards!" the Baron bellowed, in a voice that rang and echoed through his castle. "Flying intruder! The spying eye! Bring it down!" A moment later, he added, "Noted! To me!" And the chase was on. Guards in livery with chainmail beneath it, boiling out of every third room of the castle, with pikes and halberds and bills and other pointed things Dantar had forgotten the names of just at this moment, and fear rose like a coldly twisting snake within him as he made the eye dodge this way, then to that, ducking through rooms and down passages and into dimly lit antechambers and rooms too small to ante, until a too hasty turn brought him back into the presence of the Baron, who was snapping orders at Veldrin and 8 guards Veldrin had thoughtfully brought with him. "Kill the useless old one, strike off his fetters and burn him, then move the new one to his chains and make them secure." He strode a few steps, then pointed. "Fetch me my dagger. I'll be heading for the stables. I'm late for my hunt." Real fear was alive and coiling restlessly inside Dantar's guts by then, and he raced the eye high and far through rooms of shouting, pointing servants until he found a narrow but open arched window. He sped through it, and the magic faltered, the eye dropped, and he realized he was suddenly shaking, utterly exhausted. He could barely keep his head up, where he was lying propped up against one dank stone wall of his cell. With a distant thunder of heavy booted feet rising in his ears, men in a hurry pelting down the worn stone steps that led to the dungeon. Hastily, he closed his eyes and let his head loll, feigning slumber, and was only dimly aware of the goat's eye plummeting, the waiting dark water of the moat looming, and an eel leaping, maw agape, and down its dark gullet hole, just as a rough voice said, Dantar, I beseech thee, grant an old man's last wish. Dantar froze in surprise. Someone here knew him? The voice was coming from the next cell. The old man. He started to say, but no talking, you two! Veldred had his sword drawn and was waving it around menacingly, making the best of this rare chance of real action. The keys, Dorvan! A guard gave him a bewildered look. What keys? Veldred seized. Did none of you think to bring the jailer's keys? He glared around, noticed something, and snarled, or chisels, hammers, forged pliers. Manacles don't open themselves, you know. We could just chop off the old man's hands, you know, and chop off the new prisoner's hands, too, to get them on him and ruin him as the Baron's new spell hurler? Don't! Dorvan sullenly refrained from replying, and all 8 guards stood eyeing the pacing, sword-waving Veldred until he roared, Go get them! Keys, chisels, hammers, and pliers, and don't forget... He beheld their bewildered frowns, sighed sourly, and said, The prisoners are secured. We shall all go together and fetch what is needed without delay, then come back here. Are we clear? The chorus of deep, reluctant assents was brief and ragged, but no one moved until Veldred led the way back up the stairs, growling like an angry wolf under his breath. Dantar! The rough voice from the next cell came again, low and swift and urgent. I need your aid, quickly, before they return. I need you to cook my heart by calling up your fire and sending it this way. I can do the rest, but only do it after you have what I'll send you in your grasp. Dantar didn't want to cook anyone's heart, and said so, but the old man said, Please, in such a piteous voice that Dantar said, All right. It is good, came the satisfied reply, and Dantar heard the tearing of hair, and then through the thick bars of his cell door came floating a tiny bauble, a metal chest no bigger than a thumbnail, small and shining. Hide this, the old man said, as Dantar grasped it to peer in wonder, and crush it when you have great need to be elsewhere. The thunder of approaching boots was heard again on the stairs, and the old man gasped hastily, Now! Keep your promise! Dantar, son of Heligo, end me! Dantar was shocked that the old man knew exactly who he was, but a promise is a promise, and there was no time left to ask who the old man was, or how he knew, only time enough to, with a wince, bend his will to make fire. And as a stink of cooking meat arose, and wisps of smoke came drifting past the bars of his cell, the Baron's guards came rushing down the stairs, and stared, and looked astonished and then disgusted, and turned away from the cell of smoke to glare at Dantar. You did this, Veldred spat, and the Baron is going to be wroth. And he gave Dantar such a glare, as he fumbled with the dungeon keys, that Dantar hastily put the tiny chest under his boot and ground it under the heel, and was suddenly in a damp stone cell no more, but falling through glowing blue mists that rolled lighter and then darker and then lighter again, only to curl all away abruptly and leave Dantar no longer falling, but standing on soft rotting leaves in a glade in deep forest that offered only one gap of sunlight, and in it Dantar could see the pennants of the Baron's castle fluttering far below. It was a glade that also held a glowering Baron of Alvorn on horseback and surrounded by mounted guards brandishing long spears, swords, and daggers, and crossbows galore. Well now, the Baron snarled, not the stag I was seeking, but take him, alive. He doesn't need his legs, you can be brutal with those. Terrified, Dantar fled, or tried to, but he dashed less than 3 strides ere the first bolt thudded home in his thigh, mere moments before another sliced open his opposite hip, and a third slammed into his arm. He staggered, the pain was sickening, and toppled as even more bolts found him. He couldn't breathe. He was bouncing on thankfully soft soil, sinking to a stop as he tried desperately to work magic. Bits of 4, no 5, spells whirled through his mind, but there was nothing he could... The leaves under him heaved, tumbling him over, and things that were muddy bone and beyond dead were rising up from the earth, the husks and remnants of bears and wolves and slinking things he could not name. The Baron's guards shouted in fear, horses rearing, and out of the tree gloom rushed a man with no eyes that Dantar could see right through, flying fast and low and right at the Baron, whose cry of fear was louder than all the others. And then he remembered what magic he'd been trying to do and gasped out the words that would hurl cold iron away, and was shrieking in pain as all the crossbow bolts tore out of him to flee, trailing his blood across the glade. Swords and daggers and spears were flying before them and after them, and men too, their armor tugging them helplessly through the dead leaves of the loam, until Dantar found himself looking up, not at many mounted men, but just the Baron of Alvorn, alone, and clutching vainly at knife after knife that jerked out of his hands as he drew it, and whirled away under the goad of Dantar's magic. The Baron was spitting out curses that Dantar might have been very interested to listen to at another time, but not now. Not when the Baron had given up on trying to keep hold of his last knife and had bent to pluck up a fallen tree bough as big as his leg, and was growlingly stalking Dantar. "I'll club you to death, I will!" the Baron snarled, and was striding across the glade so quickly that he was already looming over Dantar, that huge tree limb swinging up, to come crushingly down. Dantar called up the same scorching chaos that had made his father send him away, magic that clawed at the tree bough and sent the Baron staggering sideways, roaring in rage and fighting to club and crush Dantar. He was going to manage it too. He was stronger than Dantar's fading magic, and it was all going to end here, amid collapsing undead and mud and churned up leaves, and... Something came hurtling through the air where there was a gap in the leaves, and Dantar could see the distant bright pennants, something small and wet and serpentine, tail trailing as it came like a hurled stone out of the blue sky to slam into the back of the Baron's head and send the descending tree bough wide and thudding into the ground with a cracking of rotten wood that left the Baron holding nothing much at all. The Baron spat out his foulest curse yet and plucked up a stone as big as Dantar's head, hefting it in both hands to smash Dantar's face as the son of Halago struggled to find his feet. He wasn't going to be quick enough. He was going to... The wet thing that had hit the Baron was the eel from the moat, the eel that had swallowed the goat-eye. Still dripping moat water. As the Baron stalked forward, triumph making him sneer madly, Dantar used the last of his magic to make the eel swing around in a great arc and into the snarling baronial mouth, in and deeper still, and the Baron's eyes bulged as he fought to breathe, jaws wedged wide but glistening eel filling his mouth like a jutting tail that had grown there. He was choking. He was wild-eyed and clutching at the eel, stone fallen. He was staggering helplessly, and he was falling, his eyes now staring fixedly at nothing at all. Dantar swayed to his feet, agony like crawling fire in his arms and legs and his hip, and tried to walk away into the forest, not knowing where but needing to get away. Away. And then the trees whirled all around him, everything going dark. When he slowly became aware of anything at all again, it was a cracked plaster ceiling, browned in places by cooking smoke long ago. There was a hard table under him. His wounds all ached dully, but with none of the fire he'd last felt, and he was both colder and warmer than before. His clothes were missing, but cloth bandages were wrapped tightly around all of the places bolts had harmed him. Kindly faces swam into view, peering down. Woman of many ages, none of them faces he knew. "Where?" he managed to blurt out, voice rough and thick. One old and hook-nosed crone bent over him, lifting a lock of hair in front of his nose to show him what was entangled in it. The tiny metal chest, as uncrushed as before he'd stepped on it. He stared at it in disbelief, and then at her. "Alvorn Castle," she murmured softly. "The Baron's guards brought you to us, after they found the Baron dead and you dying, to keep you alive long enough to tell them if, just possibly, the Baron told you the words that opened his vault before the gods gathered him." Dantar stared at her. She winked. The Baron's vault," he said loudly. "I know how to open it." A moment later, women were thrust roughly aside, and two hard men were staring down at him. One he knew he'd seen before. Baron's guards. "Tell," the other one said coldly, "or die." "No," Dantar said flatly. "I must open it alone. Deadly magic guards it. You'll have no chance at all." "I trust you not," that guard growled. Dantar shrugged. "Perhaps trust will be among the treasures inside the vault. I do it my way, or not at all." "We'll kill you," the other guard promised grimly. "You will anyway," Dantar replied, suddenly calm, as he realized that all fear had gone from him. If they killed him, they killed him. What they did instead was haul him roughly up off the kitchen pastry table and prod him with their swords to walk ahead of them, barefoot and wearing mostly bandages, through a castle full of silently staring servants to the iron-bound door he'd seen through the wandering eye. "Stand back," he told them when they were within sight of it. "No, farther. The magic is strong." 6 guards glowered at him over their drawn blades. Dantar, son of Halago, gave them a weary look. "You know there's no other way out, and I don't want treasure. I'm a rich man's son. Stand back." And he waited, and after a long and silent staring match, they reluctantly stood back. He remembered which nailheads the Baron had pushed, and in what order. So he ran his hands through his hair as he sighed to gather his wits, but really to tuck the little chest under 2 of his fingers, then stood so as to block the view of the guards as much as he could. Then Dantar waved his hands and spoke a lot of grand-sounding nonsense as he pushed on the right nails, and the vault door ground open. He flung it wide and shouted his grandest non-spell of all, flinging his arms up wildly, then ran into the room beyond, still shouting. It was large and lined with tables around the walls, with coffers and chests aplenty, but he saw a flat leather pouch. He grabbed it and found it didn't clink with coins or held anything heavy, and took it to the floor with a small coffer to slam down on the chest, just as the guards burst through the doorway cursing him. But he was falling through glowing blue mists that rolled lighter, and then darker, and then lighter again, only to curl away, all away abruptly, and leave Dantar no longer falling, but standing in the familiar trodden glade in the forest, with the pennants of the castle now catching the lowering sun of the later day in the distance, with a small coffer in one hand that proved to be full of emeralds, and the pouch that held, yes, deeds to many properties in towns and villages he did not know, and even some in Drumdown. A lot in Drumdown. He could trudge back home to try and impress his father with these, or... No, Alvorn was a task unfinished. That old woman had been kind to him, and there was the old man in the dungeon to send to the gods properly, and there'd been a lot in that vault, and if his measure of those guards had been even halfway right, they'd be busily butchering each other right now, each trying to get all of the Baron's wealth. The Baron was still lying in an unlovely heap across the glade. Dantar went looking for the daggers his magic had hurled away in that direction. Aye, if he retrieved the eel and cut the goat's eye out of it, he could sit in the forest and see matters in the castle and decide when and where to return to it. So he did that with his newfound calm. And that is how Alvorn gained a new Baron. and the rise of good King Dantar Mree began.
Hi! Welcome back to Realmspeak, and this time around we're doing this. YOCHLOL. YOCHLOL. Yes, the handmaidens of Lolth. Those tall pillars of, looks like poo, but with lots of tentacles. YOCHLOL. Not to be confused with YOCHLOL. YOCHLOL. The place in the realms. YOCHLOL. YOCHLOL is the place. YOCHLOL. The handmaidens of Lolth. YOCHLOL. And yes, you can make it as guttural as that. Most people won't know what you're talking about anyway, because, you don't see them on the street every day, hopefully. So, but YOCHLOL. Yeah, don't swallow a fly when you're summoning demons. Just don't, okay?